the goal isn't to make her mask better. I think it's to make her feel safe enough that she doesn't have to mask at all. These girls aren't hiding because they want to. They're hiding because very early on, they learn that's a very narrow version of how girls should be, this sort of like quiet, organized person. And ADHD often just doesn't fit neatly into that box. So I think instead of asking girls to shrink themselves to meet those expectations, maybe we need to question these expectations in the first place. Maybe the answer isn't how do we help her behave more ladylike. Maybe it's how do we sort of create spaces where she doesn't have to apologize for who she is. Because I think when girls feel safe to be loud, energetic and messy and, very creative, when they don't feel like they have to constantly perform, that's often where they actually thrive.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews, inspiring special guest stories, and parents sharing their real-life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire Quigley-Ward, and today we'll be talking about ADHD masking in girls and women with Dr. Ana-Maria Butura Santos, a research associate from King's College London. Ana-Maria has led what is the most comprehensive qualitative study on masking in ADHD to date, exploring how girls and women consciously and subconsciously hide, suppress, or compensate for their ADHD traits in order to meet social expectations, often at significant personal cost. Her research helps explain why so many girls appear to be coping on the outside, particularly in school, while struggling deeply beneath the surface. Welcome aboard, Ana-Maria.
Hello, hi.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So reading your soon-to-be published paper was a very emotional experience for me. I felt like you'd written a detailed account of things that I'd lived and felt for decades, but just actually never been able to adequately articulate, even with all my professional experience now and also as a parent. So I wanted to personally say thank you for doing this groundbreaking work, not just for me and other perhaps late diagnosed women, but also for helping to break the cycle for our daughters. So thank you. Let's begin by asking, how do you define what masking is when it comes to ADHD, and how does that differ from masking in autism?
Yes. So when we talk about masking in ADHD, we're really talking about people consciously or most of the time unconsciously modifying or managing their traits or behaviors to try and meet social expectations or appear typical or non-ADHD, basically. And this can look like suppressing, adapting, hiding, or compensating for their ADHD symptoms. And importantly, this is at the expense of their personal well-being. And this is important because it highlights why it's key that we talk about masking in ADHD and why we need to research more about it. These behaviors are not just individual coping strategies or typical behaviors that we see in children as they grow up and they start to adapt to the environment around them as they kind of learn about the rules and expectations and things like that. So for children with ADHD, especially girls, these rules and expectations that they learn go against who they fundamentally are. And I won't go too much into this, into kind of exactly what this means right now, because I'm sure that we'll go through it a bit later on. But when someone tries to keep up with all these expectations of them, they start to change who they are completely, which leads to this kind of identity crisis, and they start to believe they aren't good enough, which leads to low self-esteem. They start to do anything to please people around them and fit into a role that simply doesn't really fit. So masking in general, I think, both for ADHD and for autism, basically means to change who you fundamentally are to fit into a world that just wasn't made for you. But this is almost impossible for you to do without consequences. And this is possibly a big reason why so many young women with ADHD end up with a whole set of other mental health problems. And in terms of how it differs to masking in autism, there hasn't been a lot of research on this, but so far in my own research, they do seem to be quite different. So in autism, to kind of catch you up on what autism masking exactly means, and for listeners who might not know, masking is mostly termed social camouflaging in autism. And this involves things like learning social scripts, mimicking other people's behaviors or speech, and kind of generally compensating for social communication difficulties. Whereas in ADHD, while some masking does revolve around trying to fit in socially, it's mostly based on trying to regulate their ADHD symptoms to not stand out. So in ADHD, it's not really about learning social rules or copying conversations because you don't understand them. Most of the women in our study actually understood the rules very well. The difficulty was regulating their attention, their energy, their emotion, all the impulsivity, regulating all of this enough to meet those expectations. So to give you an example, in autism, people will learn that it's a social norm to keep eye contact whilst having a conversation with someone. Whereas people with ADHD know that this is a rule, but struggle to do it because they get so easily distracted. And so whilst a person with ADHD, when they're having a conversation with someone, some women in the study actually said that it helps them to focus when it helps them to focus to the conversation if they're looking around rather than looking directly at the person. But they've then realized that this is interpreted as though they're not focusing on the conversation, and they're not, the other person is thinking that they're not paying attention to what they're saying. And so they might then force themselves to keep this eye contact so that they can appear like they're paying attention, even though they're probably not, because they're focusing so much to look like they're paying attention that they're not. So it looked like, so other things in terms of masking with ADHD looks like sitting on your hands to stop fidgeting, forcing yourself to stay quiet, pretending to follow a lesson when you're really zoned out, or kind of spending hours at home over studying to compensate for things that you've missed in class. So yeah, it's less that I don't know how to behave, and so I need to then learn all of these social rules. And it's more, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do to behave, but it takes an enormous amount of effort to kind of hold myself there.
Yes. So it's a suppression or a compensation as opposed to camouflaging. And how common is masking in girls and women with ADHD?
Well, we can't really say for sure how common masking is because there hasn't been a large-scale study that looks at this. So far, there's only been a few qualitative studies kind of looking at masking in general. Well, not really looking at masking in general, looking at more so like, just kind of the life experiences of ADHD in general. And the study that is soon to be published that I did is also a qualitative study, which is basically looking at interviews with women and their families. But this one is the most comprehensive one, study that looks at masking. But based on my study, what I can say is that masking comes up again and again and again in the majority of cases. So I think out of the 30 women that I interviewed, 28 or 29 of them mentioned masking. So in my study, it came across from different ages, different families, different life stages. And importantly, it came up even though we didn't ask it directly. So we didn't go into the study with the intent of asking about masking, which is really important because a lot of the times, if you do go directly into did you mask or ask these sort of kind of leading questions, you're almost, expecting to hear back yes, especially because we are starting to hear on social media what masking is and things like that. But I think importantly about this study is that none of our questions were about masking. It just came up. The women experienced it in their own way, and it's not like they said I was masking, but through conversations, they were describing all these ways that they were adapting. They were describing all these ways. I didn't feel comfortable being myself, and so I did this. And when we look at all of that in so many different women, and all of their stories match on, and we pick up so many different very, very similar experiences in so many different people's lives. I think the repetition really suggests that this isn't like an occasional kind of strategy. I think for many of the girls and women that I spoke to, it's kind of woven into everyday life and seemed to be a very common experience for those with ADHD.
It's such an interesting point. The fact that it was never explicitly about masking questions, so to speak, and yet through the process of conversation, women and I guess the parents too were able to share examples that would have been their masking. And that makes me then wonder, and you touched on this at the beginning, how conscious masking is in ADHD, and also how early does that begin if we are kind of compensating or suppressing ourselves to fit in? Like, how young does that start?
Yeah, well, I mean, interestingly, in the study I did, it seemed the masking wasn't fully conscious. Very few people actually acknowledged that they knew what they were doing, or perhaps they kind of became more aware of it in late primary or early high school. But most women only recognized it as masking years later, kind of looking back. And a lot of them, through the conversations that we were having, when they were describing certain behaviors, and I was like, oh, why did you think that you did that? Why do you think you did that? And they were like, I guess I was trying to hide who I was, or I guess I wasn't happy with how I was presenting myself or how people were interpreting my behaviors. So yeah, a lot of our conversations did end up being quite emotional as well, because this, for a lot of them, was the first time that they were becoming aware of these things and the reason for their behaviors. And, so yeah, it was quite eye-opening to see kind of the realization firsthand through these discussions. So yeah, for a lot of them, it was more like small adjustments that kind of started very early on. Being told that you're too loud, being laughed at for daydreaming, kind of getting into trouble for moving around. And then slowly you learn, without anyone really teaching you, okay, I need to be quieter. I need to sit still. I need to not stand out, and I need to do more to keep up. I'm not enough. I need to do more. And these things are very small little things that I think happen quite early on, because girls are incredibly socially aware. And this has been shown in previous studies as well. And the women in my study as well, they knew exactly, like I said earlier, they knew exactly what to do. They knew exactly what was expected of them. And when you're so socially aware and also self-aware of you not fitting into what is expected of you, I think over time, these small adjustments become so automatic that they kind of developed into whole personas. So yeah, I think a lot of the times it's not conscious. Small things that you might be doing are conscious, but I don't think you truly realize what you're actually doing and the cost that it's going to have on you later on. And it does start really early on.
Yeah, I get a real sense of that actually from what you're saying, how those conversations are incredibly revealing. And actually even reading the examples of the conversations that are in your study, I found that to be super revealing to myself, because suddenly I'm thinking, oh my God, I do that. I'd never even considered that why I did that, or that was a form of masking. So I can see how that begins really early on, as you described it, that feeling of not being enough. I think I don't even remember a time when I didn't feel like that. So it must start super young. So when we think about younger girls, then why can girls with ADHD appear to be coping at school but struggle so much at home? And then how does therefore the masking element of this help explain that disconnect between what we as parents might see and what teachers see?
Yeah. So this was one of the most interesting things about the study that I did, and I think probably quite groundbreaking and will need a lot more follow-up for people to accept, because it really does fundamentally question how are we diagnosing ADHD only for boys to be picked up, diagnosing ADHD in a way that is going to just completely miss girls. But we'll get into that later, how what that actually means. But the difference between home and school was such a strong pattern in the interviews. I remember one specific quote from one of the women. She said that as school became less and less safe, home was the only place where she could be herself. And school quickly became this place full of expectations and punishments if you deviated from these expectations, either from your peers or from teachers. And it became this place where girls began performing, really carefully monitoring themselves, holding their bodies as still as they can, trying not to talk too much, trying to look attentive even if they weren't. And so then naturally home became a place where all that effort collapsed, where all that pent up energy and emotion came out. And the parents in my study as well described these emotional almost like explosions or meltdowns that the teachers never really saw. And it created this really painful disconnect where schools would say, well, we don't see a problem, she's perfect, while parents were thinking, how can you not see this? What's going on? I'm getting this girl at home that's completely just not okay, and we can't deal with that at home by ourselves, and at school you're saying she's completely fine. And I think, for parents as well, it was so hard to listen to, as well as the girls, because I think they got a lot of the kind of, the brunt of this at home. They didn't know what was going on. At times, I think it took a while for this explosion to happen. A lot of the times it kind of started with isolation at home, or, what they knew, who they knew their daughter was, almost like started to get a bit more distant from them and not talk to them about things and stuff. And then all of a sudden, all of these things came up. A lot of them started saying around the age of like 13, 14 was when these explosions started at home, because they just simply couldn't keep up with it anymore. They couldn't keep up this sort of front. And so it had to come out somewhere. What masking really helps explain is that this behavior isn't absent. It's just delayed or displaced in other environments. The cost of it shows up later when it's kind of finally safe to sort of let go. That happens a lot of the times at home.
So what you're saying is the reason that girls adapt their behaviour environmentally like that really comes down a lot to safety, that when they're in the home environment, that's the place they feel safest. And I guess the weight of having to hold it together, I think you used the word performative earlier, almost in a performative way, whether consciously or subconsciously, is just so exhausting that then when you walk through the door, that's when the mask comes off. And you gave a couple of experiences then in terms of what we might see as parents behaviourally, like used meltdowns, explosions. Are there any other examples of what this can look like?
So I think one quote that really stands out to me, I remember, I think this was one of the very few interviews that I did. And so I always come back to this because it's just so ingrained in my head. But she said that because she was so good at keeping all of her hyperactivity in at school, when she would get home, she would go straight to her bedroom and punch her pillows. She said that she would just go in and just punch her pillows so much to get all of this energy out. So I think it could come out in loads of different ways. And this particular girl as well, I remember she was from a different culture. So I think we have to also bear in mind that home isn't necessarily always a safe space in terms of like being upfront with it in front of your parents, because that might not be immediately accepted. And so even parents can not see this if that child feels like it's not acceptable to be this sort of like very emotional, hyperactive person at home. So this particular girl, she used to hide in her bedroom and do these things like punch pillows and kind of scream in her pillow and things like that. And I remember her saying that she wanted to ask, she asked her parents whether she could take boxing classes because she felt like she needed that to get all of that pent up energy. And she got told that that's not very ladylike. And, if she wanted to do other things, and maybe boxing wasn't the best thing for her. So that we didn't have a lot of cases where home didn't feel safe, but it was quite interesting. I think, like, for example, another participant, she had a really, really toxic family situation. And so all of that came through games. She would put herself out there in terms of her friends and online, forums and things like that. So yeah, I think it depends on the type of environment that you're in, but it can come out in loads of different avenues, whether that is physical, emotional, sometimes isolation before, these explosions, verbal. Yeah.
So it's all about outlets, isn't it? Whatever that environment is in which you feel safe. So whether that's home or alone, or through an activity, as you were describing. And you mentioned earlier on about how, when we were talking about how early these things can start, that it might begin by someone laughing at you for inattentiveness, or maybe being called out in front of the class or something like that. And I'm just wondering, how do those early sort of negative experiences shape the development of the need for us to mask? I appreciate it's not always conscious, so it's not necessarily always a choice, but it feels like actually it's the way in which we're getting negative feedback from such an early age that seems to shape and develop into masking behaviours.
Yeah, so I think something that came through really strongly in the interviews was just how early girls learn that there's a very specific way that they're supposed to be, in quotation marks. This kind of like calm, composed, very helpful, not too loud, not too emotional, not too much. And those expectations are very deeply gendered. And I think this can be a very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people to hear, but it's important not to blame per se, because I think it's so woven into our society that we don't even realize that we're doing it. But we tend to associate girls with being quiet and sensitive and well-behaved, organized and, responsible, whereas boys are often given more permission to be active and kind of impulsive and, a bit messy and maybe competitive as well. So for a girl with ADHD whose natural energy might be loud or restless, or like emotionally big, or maybe even, a bit more forgetful and disorganized, there's this immediate clash between who she is and who she feels she's allowed to be. And a lot of the women described being very socially aware, like I said earlier, quite young, that standing out socially could come at a cost, basically. And they talked about being teased and excluded and really bullied, or just really feeling very different and isolated. And this is actually backed up by a lot of research. Studies actually show that children, even as young as preschool, who deviate from gender stereotypes are at a much, much bigger risk of being rejected by their peers. And girls with ADHD are particularly vulnerable. Some studies show that girls with ADHD face up to 62% peer rejection compared to only 9% in girls without ADHD. So that's a huge, huge difference. Yeah. And so naturally, when you have those experiences early on, you start to internalize this message that being yourself really isn't safe. So instead, you try to be, this good girl, or like you people please. You kind of try to minimize yourself as much as you can. You work really hard not to take up that space. And this often means that they tend to scan their environments and ask themselves, what's expected here? Who am I supposed to be in this space? So they try to be quiet and, compliant in school, maybe a bit more expressive with close friends, sometimes, completely different in like sports or drama or at home based on what expectations that particular environment has. So yeah, the women that I interviewed said that at school they knew they weren't allowed to just get up whenever they pleased, or they would get in trouble. So they came up with ways around that. I feel like I deviated a bit from your question.
No, not at all. It's really interesting. Thank you, because it's painting quite a big picture. And I'll come back to the sport and drama thing, because I think that's a really interesting point. And what you said there about scanning, I mean, I think that's something I've done. Again, I don't even know where that began, but I know that I still scan now. And actually, even just listening to you, there was a few times I just felt like I took it was almost like a nervous system sigh, like a really deep breath, because you're just explaining, and it won't just be my experience, as you said your study found, it would be all the women with ADHD who are listening to this or thinking about it in relation to their own daughters. Oh God, I can't articulate enough how I know exactly what it is you're talking about. And you touched on right at the beginning about the fact that there is a cost or a consequence to all of this stuff. So if we think about that socially, what is the social cost of ADHD to girls? And then what happens to our identity as a result of that? Because you also touched on having a sort of identity crisis.
Yeah, so I think when I think of this question, the phrase that really stands out to me is one of the women saying that she felt like she was playing a character. And that came up quite a lot. This kind of sense of performing a version of yourself all day. When you're like constantly monitoring how you sit and talk and how you move, or how you kind of manage your emotions, it is really, really exhausting. But it also makes it hard to know like who you actually are underneath all of that sort of editing and performing all day. So the cost of it isn't just that you feel exhausted and the kind of it really the sort of energy, all the energy that it takes. It's like you say, it's the identity and the sort of confidence that you have, and like almost like eventually the inability of feeling really authentic. And like I said at the start, I don't believe that this mask can fully survive for very long, because it really takes its toll on you. I think it like shapes yourself into something that you're not, and this has really negative consequences. And it will show itself at some point or another, for some earlier than others. But a lot of women spoke about it having a huge impact on their friendships, not being able to have, true sort of friendships and relationships, because a lot of it felt superficial because they had to put on this front to sort of fit in. Also a lot of missed life opportunities. One woman talked really quite deeply about having missed a lot of her life, like learning how to drive and loads of social events and sort of like extracurricular activities, because most of her time was spent overcompensating and catching up with schoolwork and, trying to just sort of meet the basic of like social expectations. So yeah, it's a huge cost, not just mental health wise. I think in terms of mental health, there's a lot of research showing that, undiagnosed girls with ADHD, they end up with a really, really complex like clinical profile once they reach their teenage years and young adulthood. But what's not seen is all of this other stuff, like what have you missed out on all these years by trying to be a person that you're not, something that is really just not easy to be. If you were just yourself and more accepted and things, so many other things would come with that. So yeah, it's really, like I said at the start, trying to fit into a world that wasn't made for you at all. And this just can't last forever. So it does break eventually. And when it does break, you're left with not really knowing who you are, either just continuing to try and fit into this world with all of this, emotional sort of trauma that you have, or you completely break down and try to rebuild yourself. So yeah, I think, each woman has a different sort of story and way of getting out of it. A lot of women don't. A lot of women I think especially those who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who have gone through life, the majority of their life, not even knowing what ADHD is, to then being diagnosed in their, 40s and above, to then try to completely reconstruct a completely new identity with this new information that you have now. It's incredibly hard.
Yeah, it's so hard. I was diagnosed at 41. I am 45, almost 46 now. And sometimes it's hard to know where the mask starts and stops, because I think, like you said, you can't keep it going forever. So I guess there's a tendency in which these things almost become layered as you move forward. And that's a very difficult thing to start to really understand about yourself. And to your point about fitting in, I'm an ADHD coach and I work with a lot of teenage girls, and I see this so deeply, and it can manifest in a variety of ways, in some quite extreme, the impact that it's having. And it's really tragic. It's so hard. And as you said, it's a societal thing. It's so ingrained. There's almost so much that needs to be undone to fully understand that and help support them. And I just wanted to pick up on something you'd said about the gender norms bit, because I thought that was really interesting, that it can start even as young as preschool. And it made me think about myself. Like, I've got amazing female friends, but I've always felt much more drawn to boys socially. So as a teenager, I had a group of male friends who would come and meet me. I had a Friday night dance class, and they would meet me after my dance class, and they'd walk back home with me, and we'd all hang out at my house. And even as an adult, if I'm in a room full of people that I don't know, like, I'm much more likely to gravitate towards a group of men. And some of my best friends are men, and I know some people find that a bit strange, but so why do girls and women subconsciously seek more accepting social circles?
Because I think that masking takes so much effort. And so I think girls sort of try to gravitate towards spaces where they don't feel judged, basically, and where they don't need to put in as much effort. So sometimes that means maybe friends who are also a bit different themselves. And a lot of times, like you said, it's boys, because they match their sort of own activity levels. So it's a lot easier to be yourself without putting on this sort of front. I remember one of the women said that girl groups are just so socially taxing, so exhausting, especially as a teenager, with there's just so many complex sort of social dynamics that you have to manage. And I think just being around boys was so much easier for them, so that they kind of going towards groups that they don't have to be like on all the time or performing. And actually, from the very few women in my interviews who had an earlier diagnosis, they actually got picked up earlier because they couldn't mask as well. And they sort of gravitated more towards these boy groups. So they got picked up quicker than those who stayed in groups where they had to mask. Because when you're a girl and you are in these sort of more active groups or with boys and things, you stand out more. And so you get picked up quicker. Whereas if you're continuing trying to stay within groups, you're masking more, and you're not standing out from the norm. And so obviously you then get missed.
Yeah, I guess interesting, isn't it? The example you gave earlier of the girl who wanted to try boxing because she knew she needed an outlet. Even on a very subconscious level, she might not understand why she needed to do that, but she knew she needed an outlet. And those groups, because you also touched on sport and drama, and I wanted to pick up on those because they feel like spaces where ADHD traits are just not just more accepted, but actually actively valued. Because growing up, acting was my dream. Oh my gosh, I loved drama. I dreamt of being an actress. And my daughter, actually, she's sort of equally theatrical and sporty. And funny enough, I think what you're saying from a gender perspective is it's different now. I try very hard to make sure that she's had the opportunity to try lots and lots of different sports, but I don't think that's an opportunity I necessarily got myself, which is probably how I ended up following the drama route, because it was probably seen as more socially acceptable as something that a girl would be doing. But how do those environments then allow us to sort of safely be our true selves?
Yeah, so I think that these these sort of like sports and drama places were described as the only places where girls could feel very free and kind of like free to be themselves. I think, like I said earlier, girls knew exactly what environments had certain expectations. So they knew that in sports clubs or drama classes, being loud and energetic and like really expressive was allowed. So here they could actually be themselves and it didn't attract negative attention. So those spaces almost kind of gave them permission to stop masking for a while because they wouldn't be standing out from the group as much. And for some, like I remember this parent described how different her daughter was when she went into sports clubs. And this is actually how she realized that her daughter that she was struggling with inattention and like sort of focusing and things. And she was saying that in school, she didn't have any issues. But then as soon as she went to her sports clubs, her coach said, she's completely off the rails. So she doesn't really listen. Like she doesn't, she goes and and it's a completely different person that she sees at school and even at home. So the sports club actually allowed her to be herself because she felt like she wouldn't stand out if she was herself. So yeah, I think it's really, really important that we allow these expressions and these settings because they actually just might be a very healthy outlet for those who need it, but also it might help you see a version of your child that you might not see elsewhere.
That's such an interesting point, isn't it? Because if I think about myself as a parent with my children, these sports arenas, let's say, are environments where they can thrive because maybe you might struggle in school and actually you might have a natural aptitude when it comes to sport. But what you're saying there is, interestingly, is that even though it's an environment in which they might thrive, that's a byproduct of that is some of the executive functions that we might have to suppress in school because we're masking actually might show themselves more openly in those environments. And I thought that sounds really interesting. It's almost not a slight contradiction, but not necessarily what you'd expect in an environment that's much more catered to your needs. I never really considered that actually as a byproduct of that is that the mask would come off as well. And then we'll see some of those executive function challenges that we've been suppressing or masking. So on that then, what are some of those executive function challenges, issues that girls and women do mask in environments perhaps like school or other situations in order to appear like they're coping?
Yeah, I think as well as all of these overt symptoms that women talked about hiding, in our study, they also mentioned masking or more specific hiding or compensating these internal kind of hidden things that they struggled with as well. So things like losing track of time, forgetting homework, missing instructions, struggling to start tasks, and kind of just feeling really mentally chaotic and disorganized. And they did this by things like staying up half the night redoing work they couldn't focus on in class, or writing endless lists and like checking and rechecking everything, over preparing, sometimes even catching up on work during break times, or sitting next to particular people in class where they knew that they could sort of rely on that person to be like, what did the teacher say if they didn't listen or if they didn't catch it, and things like that. And even some women admitted that they went through phases where they felt like they needed to cheat on exams, or they needed to lie about, forgetting things, or lie about having finished certain type of work. And also just kind of creating full-blown like personas that are in line with what they thought others were expecting of them. And so from the outside, it looked like they were organized and very like high achieving. And I think they grow up feeling this immense pressure to avoid being labeled as lazy or incompetent. And they start to look at their female peers and realize, wait, why is everyone else seeming to find being organized and remembering things so much easier than I do? And I think there's this sort of like unspoken social script for girls and women that you're kind of expected to be the one who keeps it all together, the one who like remembers birthdays, the one who is reliable and responsible. And when you feel like you can't meet that script, you don't always ask for help because it feels like a sort of personal failure. And a lot of these women told me that they felt like almost defective, because they didn't have a name for ADHD. They just assumed that there was something fundamentally wrong with them, but they didn't want to let anyone know. Because they didn't want to let anyone down. So they just held it all in, and this built up this sort of front that everything was okay. And so masking became a sort of way of like protecting themselves from being seen as like lazy or incompetent, as many of them said. So yeah, for many women, overcompensation almost became the solution. It was like, if I just work harder than everyone else, if I'm perfect, if I achieve enough, then no one will notice how hard this actually is. So you sort of like see this shift from I'm really struggling to I'm going to prove I'm not struggling. And so they then take the hardest classes, they set impossibly high standards for themselves and study hours and hours, and they just never rest. So yeah, it wasn't really coming from like confidence or ambition. It was coming from this sort of fear that if they slipped up, it would confirm this internal belief that they weren't good enough or that something was wrong with them. So yeah, perfectionism became almost like a kind of camouflage. Like if everything looked flawless on the outside, then no one can see the sort of chaos and like effort that's been put in underneath.
God, you are describing me. I found that quite emotional to listen to. That kind of took my breath away a little bit, actually. It makes me feel quite emotional because I think that I still do now, I overcompensate all the time. And I think perfectionism often gets misunderstood because, and you use the words, it's ambition or it's something, it's a confidence thing. It's not, it's almost the opposite. It's a desire to do absolutely everything in my power to avoid ways in which I can be wrong or make a mistake or not have done enough or to show myself up, all of those things. And overcompensating is just, it's exhausting. It really is. And you said then that you can't rest, and I can't rest. I know that that's a challenge when you struggle with hyperactivity, whether that's physically externalized or whether that's a mental symptom, but it's so difficult to rest. And then when you said then about not being able to ask for help, I was like, oh my God, that is me. I don't think I've ever really understood why I couldn't ask for help. I'm trying so hard only now, to be better at doing that. But it's incredibly, incredibly difficult for me. And I've never, until listening to you speak just now, linked those two things. So that felt really profound to me because overcompensation, it's almost woven into who I am now. It's a very, very difficult thing to unpick.
I think like I've been through everything that you're going through now in terms of like realizing and things. And I think that it's only possible or, maybe much easier to understand if you have ADHD. And I think this entire process of going through doing all of these qualitative interviews and things like that, 'cause I have ADHD myself. When women talk about these things, I think it's really difficult for a researcher with ADHD to look at all of these things because you really, really try to not attach your own experience to their experience. You want to have them say exactly what they want to say without, me biasing anything. But it's hard not to start to unpick things about yourself. And, you do obviously relate to so much of this yourself, because I think it's such a universal experience for so many women that go through like such, very similar thing. But I think as a woman with ADHD, it's really allowed me to get really, really deep into what they meant even when they were talking indirectly about things. And I think that only someone that has experienced it can then end up creating this really in-depth version, like of kind of a story, to really try and get the message out. Because I think a lot of the research out there is just almost dehumanized. It's kind of just telling you these are the numbers and things, and it's not really getting to the actual like emotion and depthness of it and why it's so important, and why it's so woven into everything that we do and why so many women struggle. So yeah, it's important that all women and people with lived experience of ADHD are talking about this and trying to proper uncover like what can we do and what is the problem.
Yeah, it's translating a very deep personal experience, isn't it? And making, like you said, this is not just about the numbers. And I think it's really important to have that perspective and to understand it on that level, because of everything that we've known about ADHD to date. It really challenges that. So we have to really understand why and what that lived experience of it is. And I mean, I said that a moment ago, I am constantly exhausted. Sometimes I bore myself by saying how tired I am, but I'm just wondering, we touched on social cost and some of the other consequences, but what's the long-term cost of this, of masking, whether that's energy, sleep, self-care, mental health, physical health? We touched on identity, we've also made reference to women like myself who are not diagnosed till later in life. What are the risks long term to masking?
I think that the cost is really cumulative, like it adds up over years and years and years of strain. And when you're constantly pushing yourself twice as hard and sort of, monitoring yourself all day and never really relaxing, it takes a huge toll on you that builds up. And women talk a lot about this sort of chronic exhaustion and, sleep deprivation and migraines and anxiety and burnout and depression and all sorts of these other mental health problems that come with it. And like we said earlier, it's also this more like subtle, this kind of sense of not really knowing who you are anymore, because you've spent years of performing this like, competence and hiding all your struggles. You don't really get much space to just like exist as yourself. So yeah, it's a huge cost on your energy and your entire well-being. So I don't think that there is an element in your life where masking and not being yourself doesn't affect. It impacts absolutely everything, some more than others. Some, obviously every single woman experiences it in a different way. And like I said earlier, sometimes it comes up earlier in your teenage years as mental health problems. Sometimes it comes up later on, maybe as even like some of the parents were describing that they also had ADHD. And so this ended up meaning that they were building very superficial friendships and relationships and maybe staying in sort of very like toxic relationships. And a lot of them end up getting divorced later on because of these sort of poorer decisions that they made earlier, because they wanted to fit into a sort of ideal of a person. And so this then influences all of your decisions. If you are not yourself, you do end up going and starting relationships or friendships with people that are also not suited to you. And so this all breaks down later on. So yeah, it looks different for everyone, but I don't think that there's any aspect that isn't affected.
Yeah, especially this desire to fit in amongst that as well. You can see how that has an impact at a relationship level. One of the things I just hear all the time in my support community is how girls are either suffering from delays in diagnosis, misdiagnosis, or actually sometimes being unable to get a diagnosis because there is such a disconnect that we've talked about between that home experience, what parents are seeing, what the girls themselves are articulating, versus what school sees. That we have this situation where we have to have impairment in two environments, and it can be really difficult process for many girls, which I guess is why, for our generation it's a bit different because the understanding wasn't there, but we're still seeing that now, like girls being missed, even though parents are actively trying to seek and understand and get support for their daughters. So what do you think needs to change around the way in which we identify and diagnose ADHD in girls, particularly around the pervasiveness thing?
Yeah, I think that masking really complicates diagnosis because the systems that rely on ADHD diagnosis are based on what adults can observe. So I think that one big shift is recognizing that ADHD doesn't have to look the same everywhere to be real. Our current idea of pervasiveness often assumes that symptoms should be equally obvious across settings at home and at school. And that's what ADHD diagnosis is based on, making sure that, your symptoms and your impairments are present both at home and at school. But for many girls, school is exactly where they're masking the most because that's where the majority of expectations are, and that's where they need to fit in socially, and that's where most of the punishment comes from. So if we only rely on what's visible in the classroom, we're missing a whole bunch of people. And we probably need to listen much more carefully to parents and also to girls themselves, because they are often, like I said, they are very socially aware. I think that this is research that will be coming out later on, but I basically will be talking about the importance of self-report in children. I think we've really not given children much voice. We just expect that adults should answer for them, and that anything that we hear from children is just not reliable. But I think, and I've researched this, and basically we see that it can give us massive information, a lot of detailed information that is very important and also reliable. Self-reports can be very reliable. And a lot of the times, especially when masking happens, it can give us a lot more information that we can't really see whether we ask parents or teachers. We need to listen a lot more to parents and to children themselves and kind of ask about effort and this exhaustion and how much work it takes to appear okay, not just whether the behavior is there, but how much effort does it take to keep that behavior hidden or to achieve that school grade. I think that those are really important questions.
Yeah, such important questions. And listening to you then, I was thinking about how if we're not there yet in terms of the process of diagnosis changing, what do we do to help parents now whose daughters are struggling and they're on this path trying to seek diagnosis and support for their daughters? Because what you said about children not really having enough of a voice, I think is so true. And nowhere is that truer than in school. And I coach girls, some from as young as 8, obviously with their parents. And it blows my mind actually how incredibly self-aware children are and can be about understanding their own experiences and articulating that if we actually listen to them. So, in the absence of any immediate change to that diagnostic process, what can parents be doing right now to help achieve a diagnosis of ADHD?
I think it's really difficult to answer what parents can do because I think parents are doing so much already. That's the problem, is that they are really trying to advocate for their children and they're not being listened to. If you as a parent are seeing something that's going on at home and you're not being listened to and you keep trying and you keep trying, that's why so many parents end up going private, because they're not being listened to by their teachers and they're not being listened to by their NHS clinician or GP or anything like that. So I don't know that there is much more for parents to do than to keep fighting, to keep trying to, make them see, in terms of actually getting referred, because that's the main difficulty. I think the biggest thing that you can do is to continue trying to support your children as well as, best as you can in terms of trying to give them as many outlets as possible. And I think that the important thing is that to sort of understand that if your daughter seems fine at school but falls apart at home, that they're not imagining it, because I think a lot of parents are really they start blaming themselves. And naturally, because I think teachers often, when they hear that things are going on at home, or if they're going to GPs and they're saying something's happening at home but school is nothing, they get put onto parenting courses, or you can do better at home, or there's family issues, or there must be something going on with your parenting, and they end up blaming themselves, and they end up saying, is it me? Is it just, why is this happening? So I think the important thing is that they're not imagining and you're not doing anything wrong. I think often home is just one place where their daughter finally feels safe enough to stop pretending. And so when we understand masking, those behaviors start to look very different. They're not, laziness or defiance. They're kind of signs of how hard she's been working all day just to try and hold it together. So in terms of what parents can do, definitely learn more about it to try and understand where and how it's happening, continue advocating and continue trying to get a referral, and give your daughter as many outlets as possible so that that pent up energy doesn't have such a big cost later on. But also, I think the goal isn't to make her mask better. I think it's to make her feel safe enough that she doesn't have to mask at all. Yeah. So, because I think these girls aren't hiding because they want to. They're hiding because very early on, they learn that's a very narrow version of how girls should be, this sort of like quiet, organized person. And ADHD often just doesn't fit neatly into that box. So I think instead of asking girls to shrink themselves to meet those expectations, maybe we need to question these expectations in the first place. Maybe the answer isn't how do we help her behave more ladylike. Maybe it's how do we sort of create spaces where she doesn't have to apologize for who she is. Because I think when girls feel safe to be loud, energetic and messy and, very creative, when they don't feel like they have to constantly perform, that's often where they actually thrive. So for me, this is about like permission to be yourself, like permission for girls to take up space and to move and to be expressive and not to be perfect, to be unapologetically themselves.
That's such a powerful message. And I think a really, really important one. I love what you said there about actually just questioning the expectation rather than trying to expect either ourselves or our daughters to adapt themselves to fit it. Because I'm actually endlessly grateful. I have two children. My son is 14, almost 15, was diagnosed with ADHD at 6.5. And actually, I blame myself then, to pick up your point on that. That then led to my diagnosis at 41, and then subsequently my daughter's diagnosis. She's now 10. And I'm so grateful that it was in that order, because actually, I think I would really have struggled to get anybody to take me seriously when it came to my daughter, because she masks so much at school. She doesn't struggle as much as, say, my son had academically. And she's a people pleaser, right? So much of this stuff goes beneath the surface. But because of that history from both my son having gone through the same school, from obviously all my understanding and awareness, both as a parent and subsequently with what I do with the podcast and as a coach, that I was able to build that picture. But even then, to your point of kind of going privately and pushing, I actually still held back because I was nervous of making the shoe fit. I wanted to absolutely make sure that I really did have enough evidence to pick up on all your points to be able to build a picture that people would take seriously. So I think what you're saying is really, really important, and something that everybody needs to hear, because we still have this right now, a situation where it must impair in two different environments. And I'm just wondering, for any teachers who might be listening, to your point, that if typically the blame ends up being at home, if parents are seeing one thing and teachers are seeing another. So for those teachers who hear parents sharing the issues at home, where they can't see those signs in the classroom, what should they be paying attention to instead? Or what should they be on the lookout for that might suggest that girls are struggling beneath the surface, that they are masking?
I would often say that they need to look for this hidden effort. So the girl who seems fine but is sort of staying in at lunch to catch up, the one that looks anxious about getting things wrong, or who's very much a perfectionist and is exhausted and overly responsible. I think a lot of the times we just put that down to that's just personalities, personality, oh yeah, girls are often perfectionists, or girls often worry about getting things wrong and things like that. And also like the look at the child that takes lots of little breaks and finds excuses to leave their seat. So I don't know if we talked about this earlier. I don't think I mentioned it, but there are quite a few like observable things that you can look at, that you can pick up. So for example, girls who wanted to create more socially acceptable forms of their movement instead of getting up whenever they wanted, or because they knew that that wasn't allowed, they would create loads of excuses to move around without being, without attracting negative attention. So for example, taking loads of toilet breaks, asking to help around the classroom a lot, or like I remember one of the women in my study saying that she sharpened her pencil one too many times, or things like that, or filling up her water bottle so many times and things like that. I think like I remember when I went through my school reports and things, the toilet breaks was something I was so shocked that was included back when I was in primary school, where it was my year 6 teacher said that they needed to speak to my parents because they thought I had a urine infection, because they were like, why is she going to the toilet so many times? I didn't need to go to the toilet. It was just an excuse for me to get up and go. And, I would go at least 3, 4 times, 5 times per lesson, because I couldn't sit still. So, looking at these things, I think these subtle signs can tell you a lot more than just obvious disruption. But I do think that it's hard for teachers because they already have so much going on. So it's hard to pick these things up without having heard anything of concern about a particular child. But I think at the moment, since we are still very much in the early stages of sort of like understanding what masking looks like, all I urge teachers and also importantly clinicians to do is just to be more curious. If a parent has concerns about something happening at home but not at school, ask why that's happening, investigate further rather than just dismissing it as a family issue. And I think at the moment, that's all we can do, is just try to investigate, ask why. I think that's the thing that's most important currently.
I love that. Yeah. So many people don't stop to ask why. We jump to either trying to solve or punish, depending on whether it's a good or a bad thing. And I was thinking about what you were saying with your school reports. In many ways, it was so lucky that they allowed you to go to the toilet, because I hear the opposite, where actually, as you say, girls are trying to find these ways to allow movement, and it gets denied, which probably makes it even harder for them. And you made me think about my daughter, actually, when she was younger. This was pre-diagnosis, that they referred to her constantly as the tiny teacher, because she was just trying to help all the time. And obviously they saw this as a really positive thing, but in reality, as you say, it's a lot of masking already going on at quite a young age. So I think having that checklist will be really helpful for teachers. But to your point, I guess once they know that there's an issue, so for parents, I guess it's important for them to make sure that they're communicating and flagging that to the school, just so you can begin this dialogue and that teachers have something to start being aware of, even if it's not obviously externalized as they might be used to seeing in boys. So what final message would you like to leave parents listening to help them feel less alone, and either for themselves or to better understand their daughters?
I mean, I think I already touched on this, but it really is just that you're not imagining what is going on at home. You're not alone and you're not doing anything wrong. I think that we need to, as a society, realize that there is fundamental things that we're doing from really, really, really early on to shape all of these behaviors. And I think that as a whole, we need to, one, try our best to understand where these behaviors are coming from, but also just to encourage our children to be themselves, completely themselves, and not to try and put them into certain boxes or expectations that we have of them. And things will flow a lot easier. But I think in terms of with parents, it's really important that they don't close themselves in. And because I think a lot of the times, like we said earlier, we do blame ourselves a lot. And the same way that girls, when they start to realize that they're a bit different because they feel judged, they don't ask for help. They close themselves in and they try to solve it internally. I think a lot of the times parents do the same thing. They start to feel blamed. They start to feel like it's their fault. Maybe they're parenting wrong. Maybe they've done something wrong. Maybe they don't have a good enough relationship with their child and things like that. And so you close yourself in and you try to solve it just at home, or you try to, pretend that everything's okay because you feel like if you voice that concern, you're going to be judged for it. So I think communication is the best thing. If we unite as a society, because raising a child you can't do it by yourself. It's a community. We all have individual roles in playing to, raise a child that can function, but not only in a society that is meant for typically developing children, but with all differences and accept all differences. So I think it's really important that we communicate and that we discuss these things with fellow parents, with teachers, with our own children, try to make them understand what's going on as well, try to listen to them. Yeah, I think that's the only way forward, really, is just communication and openness.
Well said. I completely agree with you. It does take a village. And in many ways, that's how this podcast came to be, because I've always spoken very openly and honestly about my experiences parenting ADHD and my own ADHD experiences, and what started as a conversation in the playground has led to this. So I hope if people listening maybe feel like they haven't got that village yet, that support, that community, that episodes like this and conversations like this, which are so powerful and so necessary, help form that village and that community and that support. So Ana-Maria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at allaboardadhd. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.